Hello again and welcome back to Ride Rescue. On this episode I want to talk about the real heart of the problems. Before we really get into the belly of the car and where the real issue is, I had the car hanging from scaffolding that I built when I rolled the chassis out from under the body. So while it's hanging there flat, there was one issue that I really wanted to address. I had everything all clear around the back end of the car, and that was the trunk. From the factory, it appeared that the tail end of the car was slightly sideways. My thought was it had to have been bumped, it had to have been hit. But there's no damage to any of the panels anywhere that I can see where it looks like it was obvious that it had been bumped from one corner. And the tail end of the car on the passenger side was pushed over towards the driver's side so that the trunk lid wouldn't fit in that opening. To get the trunk lid to fit where it didn't hit on the passenger's rear quarter panel, you had to adjust the trunk lid sideways, cockeyed in that trunk lid hole. So to get it parallel with both fenders or along the back package tray area to the back window, that area had a tight gap on the driver's side corner and a big wide gap on the passenger side corner. Really irritated me. So to get that to fit right, there's a couple of options. One is to shave and weld and change the shape of the trunk lid, which is just not ideal because if anything happens to that trunk lid, you got to do it again to make it fit. The other is to pull the whole tail end of the body over and get it straight with that trunk lid the way it should have been coming out of the factory. The only way to do that was to put a cable, come along from corner to corner and pull the tail end over so that the trunk lid fit in that opening. I tried and tried and it was stressing everything because of the trunk floor. The only way to get it to smoothly pull over and then weld it back down was to cut the three sides of the trunk floor. At both quarter panels at the drop-offs, have to break that loose and then either cut all along the back end or cut along the front end of that trunk floor so that it would be able to freely be moved. Fortunately, the trunk floor was bad, so I didn't feel horrible about cutting it out. To have to cut that out and weld it back in, I could do that. Both corners of the trunk floor, where it mounted to the frame, were rotted out. So those corners need to be repaired. So it would have been nice if I could just do those little patch panels. But one other area in the trunk that really bothered me is it looked like somebody had had the car up on jack stands and it had slid off, or it slid off the jack right between the gas tank and the frame rail. The trunk floor was all pushed up. And I got in and I jumped on it and pushed it all down, but it just all wrinkled. It looked terrible. There wasn't any real rust other than those two corners, but it was so stretched and warped and twisted that it was just something I couldn't live with. So since I've got to cut all the way around and pull this tail end over, it's like, all right, it's given. Just cut the whole floor out of the trunk, put in a whole new trunk. You could buy a trunk for this car. They didn't sell one for the Buick, but they had one similar that goes in the GTO. GTO, the tail end where it goes to the taillights is a little bit different, but my shelf there where it's reinforced made it up really good with the GTO, so that ended up being a good splice and a good seam place for it to all come back together. The trunk floor came in 3 pieces the way it was remanufactured. The 2 seams are right above the 2 channels that support the gas tank, where the gas tank straps are. Kit came with gas tank channels as well. So that ended up working out really well. So once I cut that floor out, then I was able to take the cable come along, pull the tail end over just exactly where I wanted it, and I welded in a cross brace, closed the trunk lid, everything fit perfectly. But my fear was that as I release all the stress on the trunk, that it's going to come back just a little bit. So I jacked it over about 1/8 of an inch, a little bit more, probably 3/16 of an inch beyond where it was, so that it was now cocked off opposite side. and I welded in that brace. So then once I went back in and welded in the floor and I released that pressure, it actually went perfectly. So I was glad I thought ahead and went a little bit beyond, because the memory of the metal does have a tendency to want to go back to where it came from, especially when everything has been welded. So once the floor was in, I cleaned up the drop panel areas. I cleaned up the fender wells where the fender wells came down. They were pretty rusty, and when I drilled out these spot welds, it just kind of crumbled away, so I had to cut those areas off. So you can see inside of the driver's side wheel well where I had to go back and put in some patches, just cutting some strips of tin, putting a bead of weld on it, putting in the spot weld look, and then doing the same thing around the back end of the wheel well, for the inner wheel well and the outer wheel well, and then tying into the trunk floor. One other thing you might notice, now that the trunk floor is all in and I've got it all sanded and ground down, on the passenger side, the trunk floor originally had some bulged areas for mounting the jack and mounting the spare tire. There was a loop area that was welded on that stuck up so you could put a hook through to bolt down the spare tire. So my thinking of down the road, maybe doing something real high-end custom, now's a good time to do that. I'd rather do that now and then maybe think about restoring it if I change my mind, than keeping it original and then having to go back and start cutting away on a custom car, especially if I end up going as high-end of a show car. So now that I got the trunk area all finished and completed, well, the car is still hanging on the scaffolding and everything is flat, and I've tried to keep the car as level as possible. And I have all of the body still braced so that nothing is going to get tweaked. Now's the time to cut out that floor brace, the brace that the back of the seats mount to, both ends of the seat belts. There's 4 seat belt areas. That is all rotten. And so you can see in these pictures where that channel, I've cut out the floor. It was all rusted. It was just Swiss cheese where that channel goes. And then the driver's side rear seat well, the foot well, that was all Swiss cheese. There was a lot of holes in there, so that was going to be easier to just cut that whole area out and get a patch panel. There's aftermarket patch panels that fit in there. There's an aftermarket channel that goes across side to side on those rockers that I can put in to restore the mounting for the seats and the seat belts. And then on the passenger side rear foot well, that was just rusted in that strip where the channel goes. So I can just take some tin, some thin tin metal, and cut and bend my own patches for that. There's no reason for me to buy a whole patch panel for that whole area. It's going to be easier just to do those strips and then weld in some spot welds to reinforce all of that area. So that ended up being fairly simple. It took a few hours to weld in that foot well and weld in the brace. But then once that area is in, then I can take the car and pull it up on its side and hang it from the scaffolding, and then I can work on both sides of the car. Now that I know it's much sturdier with the floor being in, with that cross brace being in, and I was able to beef up the rocker panels. Now I've got it strong enough that I feel comfortable about getting up on its side, and I can refinish the whole floor of the car. So now I can get to the inside of the rockers and see where the real damage is. Fortunately, it was very minor. Yes, at the A-pillars, there are several layers of metal in there, and you can see in the inside of this rocker where just by tapping on it, it just all gave away. There's a pretty stout sheet of metal on the inside of that, so I had to cut this area open. Fortunately, I didn't get pictures, or I've lost track of those photos. But pretty thick metal, it's like 1/16 of an inch thick, a fairly good gauge, that went up the sides of the rockers on the inside of the A-pillar, but that area was all rotted. So put in a new toe kick area where the floor came into it. The floor wrapped around and came down on the inside of the rocker. That one had rotted away too. So there was 3 layers of metal there that I had to restore. It was just strip pieces. It wasn't anything really major. It was just a lot of layers to have to expose, weld back in, and cover the layers all back up again. Worked out beautifully. With everything braced on the body, it held everything perfectly straight. Everything stayed where it was supposed to be. So now I can get it hanging flat and roll the chassis underneath and lower the body back on. As I'm getting ready to drop the body back on the chassis, I'm just browsing on the internet, and I notice in my area there's a 64 Skylark two-door hardtop for sale that is missing its engine and transmission, and it has some heavy rust in the whole trunk area. But it has a lot of great parts on this car that I can juggle back and forth and pick out and sort through the best pieces. It was $200. It was a no-brainer. It cost me $200 to go get the car, so I ended up being $400 into it. But when I got the parts car home, I pulled it into the garage and I set the two side by side. So I've got my body on the scaffolding, I've got the chassis rolled underneath it, and I'm tearing my parts car all apart, and I'm picking through. The driver's side floor of the parts car is perfect. The driver's side floor of my convertible is got some Swiss cheese in it. Well, that was going to be fairly easy to fix, I thought, but there's a seam that runs across right about where your heels would be when you're driving. That seam was rotten. Once I cut that seam all out, I could piece in some strips, but it was not going to look anywhere near factory. And if you look underneath the car, you can see that area. It's exposed. So having the parts car, I could cut that floor out and weld it into my convertible. I had a factory look that I couldn't even get from aftermarket parts. The aftermarket parts, that was all one piece. So that was a great find in itself, just for that piece to go in the driver's side. And then my car originally had a bench seat. So you can see in one of these photos, there is a blue bucket seat. Got checking online at my local ads, and I found a set of GTO seats, 67 GTO seats, that I really like the look and the feel of those. They're more rounded, they're a little bit more of a bolster on them. The original bucket seats for a 64 are really square, just blocks. They're not very attractive and they're not very comfortable. But the 67 GTO seat is a pretty comfortable seat. And they fit right up with the tracks that I have. The seats that I bought on the GTO seats were pretty rough. They didn't have the tracks. A lot of the foam was shot, so I was going to have to get new foam for them. But I could completely restore these. You can buy kits for them. And so I had it in mind of what the look that I was after. And it was kind of a 68 Chevelle look. So those seats are going to be perfect for what plans I have for the interior. So I'm really excited about those seats. So now my bucket seat braces are welded in. The patch panels are all welded in the floor. My A-pillars are reinforced. Everything is perfect. So now it's time to lower it down. Lowered it down on the chassis. My polyurethane bushings, all new hardware and bolts, all new washers, and got it all perfectly squared up on the frame. So now the body's back on the chassis. It's getting pretty exciting. I can start putting all the panels back on it, realigning everything, get the whole front end back on, get all the doors on. I've got my parts car. I'm swapping parts back and forth. I'm checking fenders. I'm looking at different doors and trying to decide which is the best parts to put on it. Now that I've got it set in my mind that I want to go custom on this car, I want to have that RestoMod look and feel about the car. I want it to have the look that General Motors intended without getting any real crazy modifications, but just tighten things up, tuck in the bumpers, tighten up all the door edges, the trunk, the hood. And now that I've got the trunk fitting perfectly in that hole and all my lines are real tight and straight, the problem is right along the back end, right where the bottom edge of that trunk lid closes against the back panel and the trim. The gap is huge. I mean, it's wide enough I can stick my fingers in there. And the keyhole, the way the keyhole is, it's not very attractive, so I've decided I'm going to smooth that off. And in order to smooth it off, then I've got to put in some kind of a power trunk release. I'm at the wrecking yard and I'm looking at different trunk releases that I can adapt to this car, and I stumble onto a Cadillac. I think it was a late 80s, early 90s Cadillac that has the power trunk pull down. So it has the trunk release, but it has the pull down. Now, if I go with really tight gaps, when you slam these trunks shut in order to get them to latch, if you want the seals and everything to be right nice and tight, you chip the edges of the trunk lid. I did it with a '69 Camaro show car, and I wanted all those nice, tight, straight gaps, but then I was always having to be really, really careful. And if somebody slams it, it chipped off the edges. And that did end up happening after I had the car for a few years. So with this car, if I can adapt a trunk pull down from a Cadillac and a release, I can make it so that the way the pull downs work is you close the trunk and it's open about 3/4 of an inch, and then it automatically, easily, smoothly pulls it shut, and then it'll go click and it latches. So the way it works is the latch inside of the trunk lid has to be replaced, and that's where the release mechanism is. And then it latches against the bracket that sticks up on the pull down, and it latches into that, and then it just pulls it down smooth. You can see in these photos, I had to modify the trunk lid quite a bit. I had to cut that area out, cut and fit and smooth and make those brackets from the Cadillac fit in the car. But since I have a parts car, I was able to start hacking away at the parts car and make sure it worked first before I destroyed my trunk lid. And then at the lower area, the bracketry and the power motor that pulls it down, everything fit inside of that lower bracket. So again, I toyed with it in the parts car, was able to make everything work. I had to make a little bracket that mounted to that, where the Cadillac parts would bolt to, but it ended up being pretty simple. It was just a couple of pieces of sheet metal, a top plate that would cover it up, because in that hole in the top of the Buick trunk piece, it was a pretty good opening. You could see down in there, you could see all the parts. It wasn't very attractive. So by putting a plate across the top of that, I had to shape it for the Cadillac part. It worked great. Okay, let's talk about the dollars spent on this car. It's that time again. The total I've spent on the car to date is $12,000. For this segment, I spent $1,500 on sheet metal parts for the trunk and the floor brace, as well as some miscellaneous welding, wire, and materials that I needed. I spent another $400 on a parts car. I'm sure I will get all of that money back and then some once I sell off all the excess. But there's a lot of great parts on that car that I'm able to use on this project. And then I spent another $300 on GTO bucket seats that I found locally, as well as the mounting plates that go on the floor for the bucket seats. Labor-wise, I've added up another 210 hours of labor, and at my shop rate that I calculated $55 an hour, that's another $12,000 in labor. Now with my $14,000 in cash outlay and $24,000 in labor, this project has now reached a grand total of $38,000. At the time this car is even restored beautifully, maybe could get in the high 20s. So dropping it off at a shop, you better love the car and love the project to spend that kind of money, because at shop time it would be a whole lot more than $38,000. But I'm doing it as a labor of love. Goes right back to $14,000 in the bank. I'm still not over my high water mark at $14,000. Once the car is all put back together and finished, as long as I don't get real crazy and spend a lot of money, I'll get all the money back. Thanks again for watching my videos. Like, share, subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate you tuning in. Any support you can give me, I appreciate it. TTFN. Ta-ta for now.